Tonight, we discuss how to shrink evil philosophically and very, very practically. So, this week's Torah portion, this week's Parsha is Vayishlach. The entire last Aliyah, meaning, of course, the Torah portion, is divided into 7 sections. The final section is listing the dynasty of Seir that lived in Esav's land before him, all the kings of Edom, and then the chieftains of Esav. Many verses. I counted 24. So we have 24 psukim, an entire aliyah, all listing people absolutely evil. All mamzerim, relationships that would blow your mind. If you want your mind blown, you could peek into the Rashis there, beyond any soap opera drama of today. Crazy, horrible, evil. And then they're all nothing. They're all gone. They're all destroyed by the sparks of small Yaakov. So what do we get from this? So I felt this was a very powerful lesson in terms of a basic point we always want to remember: not to be intimidated by evil, not to be scared, not to think it has power. Things can look big and powerful, and they crumble in the face of godliness. And what does this mean for me? What about me? Well, many times we're in a situation where things can scare us. Someone reached out to me. There's someone running for president that has a swastika in his logo. I mean, that's scary. Only if you believe in his power. Only if you believe in that power is it scary. So on a global level, I think it's sort of easy sometimes to understand, to see it clearly. There's no power. There's no fear. All is in God's very good, secure hands. But it's also true on a personal level. Now, we don't think of the term evil in our personal world, but when we see things that are wrong, that are negative inside our children, our spouse, our parents, ourselves, we also shouldn't fear that evil, and we shouldn't believe in its power. And our lack of belief in it is the key, the secret to destroying it. And that's what I wanted to focus on today. I wanted to make this very practical. I'm sure everything I said until now was like, yes, we know this. Of course, this is true. Of course, this is important. And I'd like to try to make this practical. So you are nervous or bored, you're overeating, then you're upset with yourself for junking up your body, and you're still doing it at the same time. What are you supposed to do with this perspective of, I don't want to believe in this. I don't want to vitalize this by my belief in it. So, one, I have to identify this as evil, an evil that's gripping me on the inside, an evil that's getting me to feel bad and to do what I resolve not to do. That's step one. Step two, to remind myself that evil has no power unless I empower it. And step three is ignore it. What does that mean, ignore it? Well, in this situation, force yourself to be in a good mood, or act like you're in a good mood, because obviously this is a ploy to get me upset. So I have to keep ignoring it by forcing that positive energy. I have to keep acting with positive energy. I have to put on happy music, start dancing with your kids, act weird, act hyper. Just ignore it. Hum if you're alone. Dance yourself. You're alone. Just keep moving and doing and acting until that negativity goes away. If the goal is for me to be upset, I'm going to do everything but. It's sort of easier to understand it in ourselves. Of course, it's very important in ourselves as well. Let's say your child is having a meltdown, and they're not 3 or 4, they're 10 or 12. A full-blown, irrational, crying, screaming, pain, anger, meltdown. I'm sure we've seen them. I need to, one, identify this as evil, an evil that's gripping this child on the inside. 2, remind myself that evil has no power unless I empower it. And 3, I have 4 steps this time. Consciously choose and resolve to not empower this evil. And 4, ignore it, which in this case is rather simple. Ignore the meltdown, the scream, the cries. When I say ignore it, this is a hard challenge for us. You have to ignore it on the inside. Meaning, we don't mean ignore the child. We don't mean extra focus on the child. We mean interact just as you were before the explosion, as if this is not happening. We're not ignoring the child. We're ignoring the negativity. We're ignoring the irrational tantrum. We're not ignoring the child. We're not focusing on the tantrum, we're ignoring it. We're just interacting as if it wasn't going on. That is not easy. I know it sounds very easy when I'm sitting here and saying, and this is step 3 and this is step 4. Obviously, it's not easy. Been there, done it. It's not easy, but it's a very powerful tool. Don't empower it. It's not being fed by anything. It goes away. Aliza.
So when we're not empowering evil, I'm thinking about, like, for example, the organization Camera that deals with the anti-Semitism in the news, and then they look to combat that. So instead of looking to combat things like such an organization, we're supposed to just ignore the anti-Semitism?
That's a very interesting question. It's very hard to, what do they do? How do they combat it? What's their approach?
I can't say 100% because I'm not in it. Like, I'm familiar enough to know of its existence. But I believe they look to educate people with correct information rather than the misinformation.
Okay, so what you're saying they're doing is they're not focusing on this isn't true and this is why. They're saying we're here to promulgate the truth.
I think so.
Okay,
so I'm not sure.
That's like not focusing on the tantrum, focusing on the child, but not on the tantrum. In other words, everything is, it's an excellent question you're asking. And the basic rule is when we put our energy in something, we're giving it power. If we put our energy into all the evils out there in the world, we're actually empowering them by our energy. Now, I'm not even aware of this organization. I don't know its name, so I can't yes or no anything about it. But my perspective would be, and I'm not saying what they're doing is right or wrong, I don't know them at all, is if we want to combat anti-Semitism by putting out the truth about Israel, something like that, so then they're not focusing on the fear and bashing all those anti-Semites. You're saying, we're the voice of truth. Let's give you the truth story. You want information. Let's give you the real information, then make a decision. So that would be focusing on the light, not focusing on the darkness. But if they're more like, I know, no, this might have been for other reasons as well, but I know, well, maybe it's not a good example because I think it was for other reasons as well. I'm thinking of something, but it wasn't only for the point I'm saying, so I don't want to misconstrue what happened. It's yeah. Again, I don't know if that's what they do, and I'm not saying whatever they're doing is wrong. I'm sure they're a wonderful organization and doing great stuff, though I never heard about them before in my life. But we're just going to give that general assumption of good. But yeah, I mean, just think of it on a very personal level. If you watch, I always tell people that, that watch television, the worst station to watch is the news. If you're going to cut back anything, cut back first on the news. Why? Because it's designed to scare you. So you keep watching. It's designed to evoke fear. So it's evoking fear by focusing on all the negativity. And it's such a skewed perspective that if you just keep watching the news or listening to the radio news stations, you really feel this world is like every corner there's lurking another horrible mass murderer, God forbid, or something like that. Because that's what they keep bombarding you with. So we can energize that negativity by fearing it and thinking about it. Or we can say, I want to go with light. I want to focus on the good. I want to focus on the positive, and I don't want to put my strength in anything that's negative. I don't know if that answered your question, but that would be, I think, the general answer. Anyone has more information or has any way they want to comment on what Aliza said, besides Dorit, who says she can't talk?
I have another question with it, if it's okay. Sure. So in terms of not empowering the evil, so we literally have a mitzvah to eradicate Amalek, so the epitome of evil. So it would seem that the ignoring would be not mentioning Amalek at all, rather than actually stating that we have this mitzvah to eradicate, obliterate, destroy, and then it's actually giving attention.
It's a great question. The difference is that's hatred, not fear. What we don't want to do is empower something. You don't empower something by hatred. You empower it by fear. So if you're fearful of Amalek's powers, you're strengthening it. Your hatred is this like laser beam to destroy it. Dina?
It reminds me of my grandparents when they were alive. They were like very big like TV news watchers. And every time I would talk to them, it's like, oh, did you hear about the murders in New York and all the crime? And are you safe? And I'm like, safe from what? Like, what? And I was so confused. They were always so like on edge and nervous. And it just like made me like really hyper aware that like my perspective and what I put focus on is my reality. And like I never knew there was crime in my neighborhood because I never thought about it. Or like, you know, there's a big church around the corner from me, and someone kept saying, "Oh, you know, the church on your block," and I'm like, I don't know, I have a church on my block? Like what? Because like just what I'm putting on is not the church. Reality does not include the church on my block, and it made me so hyper aware of that.
Right. Now, I'm not saying, okay, everything you have to put in context. Obviously, if there's some, I always sort of feel like if I need to know something, I'm sure I'm going to hear it. Because I'm sure plenty of people somehow make me aware of what I need to be aware of. And I'm not saying we should be reckless and careless, but I want to go back to what Aliza said. So I appreciate what Dina's saying, and it is, again, she's saying her grandparents were maybe not an extreme, but like many Americans, just very much like swallowing it all in and absorbing all those messages of fear. So Aliza asked a really, really smart question. She said, why am I saying to ignore it when we are commanded to hate? Hate is a focus. Hate is not ignoring. And my answer was, fear is empowering. Hatred is not empowering what you hate. Hatred is coming from, like, if you can almost envision, a strength, a power, a force to destroy that object by my hatred. Fear means I'm giving it power. And that's what we're trying to avoid. When your child is having that meltdown, I don't know, obviously you don't feel hatred for your child, you don't feel fear of your child, but you're thrown and stressed by everything going on that's taking over this child. And that's the space we don't want to get into. At the same time, we don't want to like just feed the tantrum by talking about it, but just keep moving as if it doesn't exist. And of course, you know it exists, so you try to be light and fun and distracting, and unfortunately you have a lot of experience with this. Distracting, engaging, talk about something else, but just going into that place just feeds it. And that's exactly what we don't want to do. Dina, do you have another question? Is that your hand raised from the previous one?
I'm sorry, I forgot to lower it.
No problem. I just want to make sure I'm not ignoring someone. And now I see Aliza's hands up. Do you have another question, Aliza?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay, so then going back to the Parsha where we see, as you said, that we go through all the Doros of Seir and Edom. So I always understood that America is an extension of the Roman Empire of Edom. So while those kings are not here, America, although not to get into any major politics, although there are specific politicians in power right now who seem to be doing their best to destroy America, but America still is here for all practical purposes.
The Lubavitcher Rebbe said in 1992 or 91, it was around this time of year, actually, I think it was last week's Torah portion. So it was probably in November of 91 that Edom is refined. What does refined mean? It means the sparks that were trapped, that were feeding evil, are released. So you have two options within refined, and they both could be happening depending on who you're looking at in America. Refined could mean good. This was an evil force that is refined and now good. Or refined could mean, I can't think of the appropriate English word for it, but there is one. Like when you remove the charge, when you remove the power and it's just deflated. Kabbalistically, it's explained that Yaakov, this is actually going to this week's Torah portion, had refined Lavan, last week's Torah portion, and he thought he was now going to refine Esav, but Esav was not ready for that. So if you read the Torah portion, if you read the last verses about Lavan, he's still not a good guy. It was very interesting, like I pointed out to my husband, Lavan didn't listen to God. The end of last week's Torah portion, God says to Lavan, don't say anything to Yaakov, to Jacob, no good, no bad, we don't want anything. Well, Lavan didn't listen. I mean, he didn't hurt him, so he had enough fear of God, but he kept talking to him, engaging him. He blessed them before he left. We don't want his blessing. So clearly he's still not a good guy. But it says Kabbalistically, Yaakov refined him. So what does refine mean in that context? It means he extracted the energy that was there. He extracted all of his enormous spiritual power So instead of it feeding this warped, evil, horrific person, it was now part of Yaakov's arsenal, and he was deflated, had no strength. All of his power was gone. He was refined, meaning the godliness that was trapped inside of him was extracted, and he's just this deflated balloon. And we see clearly from that point on, he never got involved in us. He never harmed us. Esav existed. Esav was Edom. Esav was Rome. Esav had a lot of power. Lavan, who Kabbalistically comes from such an enormous level of godliness that obviously in him was feeding evil, all of that went to our side. He's deflated. He's refined. So when the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that Edom, Esav is refined, I remember very clearly once giving this over in a class, and in the class there was a Holocaust survivor who got so upset with me. So upset with me. I was like, not my words. A text. This is Lubavitcher Rebbe's words. Could not swallow that. I think if I'd explained this here, it might have been better. So refined could mean one of two things. Going back to Lisa's question about America. Refined could mean the power that has fed Rome. Rome, of course, has morphed into the Catholic Church. In a sense, the whole Christianity, which is the Western world, the Western civilization, of which America is now at the helm, it's all extracted. They have no more power. It's a facade. It's a nothing. It's a ghost town. Cannot harm you anymore. We got those sparks through all of our service and exile. That could be for some. And for some, refined could mean, as we would understand the word refined, that now they're using their energy for good. And I believe in America, there are some and some. So the ones that are using their energy for good, they're refined. The evil has been mitigated through all the work we've done. They have power and they're using it for good. And others, refined means like Lavan. The energy was extracted. They can make a lot of noise, but they're not going to hurt us because their energy was refined. It was taken away from them and given to us. So that's how I would look at this last residue of the Roman Empire here in America in terms of how we can react to it. Miriam.
So I don't know, with everything that's going on with a certain crazy Meshuggah out there who's spewing horrible things about Hitler, Yamach Shemo, and all that stuff. I think everyone knows who I'm talking about. We shouldn't be scared of that. We should just say...
You should absolutely not be scared. Absolutely do not be scared. You could hate if you'd like, but don't be scared. Just think of it very simply. If you're scared of him, you feed him.
It's not that I'm scared of him in particular. I'm scared of the million followers that follow what he says and go along with him.
And you feed their power by fearing them. This is exactly the principle. You feed their power when you fear them. When you fear them, you're taking your energy, the energy of a Jew, and it goes into their camp. Your fear makes you vulnerable that they can take your energy. It's feeding them. Just as if you can imagine you're a child and there's a bully in the playground. The more you fear the bully, the more you're a target of the bully. The more you fear the bully, the more power the bully has. So you could say, but these people don't know me. I'm safe in my house and it doesn't make a difference. Energy is energy. As you fear, you feed them. So we don't want to feed them. Again, taking Elisa's very good question. If you feel you want to energize your hatred of them, that's definitely a version of Amalek, and you could definitely do that. Or you could just ignore it and say these things come and go, and we're all old enough to have seen many such waves, and we trust God, and we don't trust the evil. We don't believe the evil has power, and we're not going to give it any.
But sometimes I feel like Hashem is putting these words in his mouth to, this is just the way I feel, to say, listen, it's time to go home. It's time to go to Israel. It's time to leave. Just go. I'm putting these
and
words
maybe
in his mouth.
And then that could be a good motivation. In other words, if I definitely know COVID and American COVID, I mean, Israel was pretty bad in COVID also, but everything that was happening in our country during that time that we all experienced definitely motivated some people to decide Israel seemed like a safer option. Great. So from something bad came something good, right? From the destruction, right? The Shimshon's example, from the skull of the lion comes the honey. So if you're processing it through your vantage point as, This is good. Now my husband's on board. We're going to Israel. You're taking something bad and you're doing a little personal transformation. Don't fear it. Just use it as a catalyst of growth, a catalyst of just a reminder call that this is not my home. But don't fear it. You can react to it, but don't fear it, because fearing it is empowering it. Just as, again, bringing it back home. If you saw something in your child and you feared that, you'd be feeding it. Well, you don't want to feed it. You want to heal it. You want to deal with it, but you don't want to feed it. So literally, we are so powerful. And therefore, our fear gives that other side a lot of energy that we don't want to give them. So the first step is remove your fear. And I would say a very simple way to remove your fear is don't watch it, don't read it, don't listen to it, don't talk about it. Like, just don't go there. We don't have to solve those problems. There's enough other people that are sure they have to solve those problems. So we will let them. And you focus on good. You focus on strengthening the good, strengthening the godly, strengthening the good in the world, which also ripples in and changes the world. You know, the famous metaphor that's not mine at all is of that, you know, very quiet pond, and you put in one pebble and then the ripples. Well, that's us. That's the Jewish people in the world. So when we strengthen the light, when we strengthen the good, the world shifts. When we take light and channel it, as Kabbalistically we would say, in vessels of our good deeds, the evil doesn't have power. The evil is being fed off lights, not channeled, not in vessel. We channel those lights. We contain those lights by doing good, by doing God's commandment. And then we take the energy and we put it on the side of good. And that's what ripples into the world. And the world literally shifts to good. And we've seen tremendous shifts to good in the world. There's so many things in the world that are just so different than when we were growing up. The world is morphing to good. And there's a lot of noise of other stuff, but I view it as just noise. Or maybe, like you're saying, noise to get you to do something good.
I'm sorry, one more thing. Just, I feel like if we ignore it, also that's not good. Like, and I don't mean to be so extreme, but like, this is what happened, you know, in Poland or whatever. Like, when the Holocaust was about, you know, starting, people would be, you know, it's time to leave, and some people, no, we're staying. It's all good. Everything's gonna be fine. And until it wasn't.
I hear you. And again, I think going to Israel is a wonderful thing. So if you can get yourself to Israel through this, great. At least something good came out of it, right? So it's wonderful to go to Israel. It's wonderful always to go to Israel. In terms of, though, this fear of like this Holocaust, which of course is a trigger for all of us in the post-Holocaust world, even though I personally, you know, all of my grandparents were already in America. So I guess why we're all here. So I didn't have any personal relatives that I knew that experienced it, but still, as growing up, you know, when I did in the 60s, this is post-Holocaust world. So of course that's part of our psyche to have that like knee-jerk Holocaust fear. But this world is not the world of the 1930s. It's not the world of the 1930s. It's a different world. And honestly, though the news wouldn't have you realize this, it's a better world. Literally, the world has shifted. I said before, I quoted something from the Lubavitcher Rebbe where he said how Esav, Rome, Edom, the Western world, America, which by the way, the Rebbe always very highly regarded America. The Rebbe always referred to America as the kingdom of kindness. There are flaws, but overall, a good place. Something else the Rebbe focused on, this was also in 91 or 92, if any of you remember, there was a sort of, I guess you call it a civil war going on between Bosnia and Sarajevo. Very vicious, horrific war. Very vicious, very horrific. And of course, Friendly News, as we're talking about, kept feeding America pictures of the horrors going on, the abuse of the women, the children, the cold, the sickness, the horrors, the starvation. And the American public responded in such a fashion that the government decided to use our military to drop supplies to the people in these countries that were undergoing this really nasty war. And the Rebbe focused on that and said, look what's going on. This is unheard of. America's taking their army, taking their medicine, taking their food, taking their clothing, and they have nothing to gain from it. It wasn't a political maneuver to gain anything. There's nothing they're gaining from Bosnia or Sarajevo or world opinion. It was actually done altruistically. because we saw people suffering and we cared. That's a big shift in the world. And there's so many other shifts we could talk about. There's so many ways the world has changed. The whole imperialistic notion is gone. There's actually a tremendous lessening of war in the world, civil wars, wars between countries, even terrorism that we so fear. But if you actually look at the statistics, it's going down. And we wouldn't realize that because that's not what the news is going to tell us. But literally, the world today is not the world of the 1930s or 40s. It is a different world. And we're not fearing an impending, one more time, God forbid, situation like that. We know we're walking to good, we're walking to godly, we know we're walking to Mashiach, and we're not walking backwards. That's not this world. Eliza? Oh, sorry. Dina?
Wait,
So
sorry.
Oh, okay. Oh, you put down your hand. I thought you put down your hand like, oops, no, I didn't get my hand
I was
raised.
trying to unmute and then I got my hand down first instead of
Right.
I'm sorry. So going back to the Parsha then, because that's what I keep, going back to and thinking about, okay, so if Yaakov was able to, however we then understand, extracting the power from Lavan and refining him, and he thought he would with Esau, then why would he send gifts to Esau? Because gifts to me, like if we take it back to your original example of a child tantruming, doing something we don't want. So we don't reward positive incentives to bad behavior. Instead, we do from every standpoint. We ignore the tantrum. We wait until it passes. As long as they're safe, I've even literally picked up a child once in the middle of the street and said, okay, put them down on the sidewalk and said, now you're in a safe place. Now you can continue your tantrum.
Great. Thanks for the green light. What I would say to that, no, I hear what you're saying. Here's the question. So there's a lot of different commentators that focus on why Yaakov did what he did. And there's so many different answers to your question. It's a great question. And obviously it's something we do need to wonder. The answer from the Kabbalistic perspective, going back to what I was saying, was that Yaakov was looking at Esav very differently than his true reality. Meaning Yaakov had just spent 20 years. This is, by the way, still talking about the Parsha. That was last week. This is this week where we're doing our job here. Yaakov, last Torah portion, last week, had spent 20 years, by the way. It's several verses, but it's actually 20 years in the house of Lavan. It was 20 years of extracting those sparks. And he had done it. He had extracted all the sparks. Lavan was deflated. He wasn't a good guy, but he couldn't hurt him at all. He really thought, I've worked on myself so much. Okay, you see such a pure, holy person. It's very interesting. Yaakov is the only one we know that's biblically referred to as pure, and he had to deal with the most corrupt, twisted people in the world, a Lavan and an Esau. But pure Yaakov, after all of his experience, if you want to say naive in his purity, thought to himself, listen, I haven't seen my brother for a long time. He had not seen his brother for 34 years. He's grown up a lot over those 34 years. I've changed a lot over those 34 years. I've worked on myself and worked on myself. So when Yaakov was giving the gifts to Esau from a Kabbalistic perspective, this was part of the connection that he was drawing him in to pull out his sparks and refine them and release them. It wasn't the thought of, oh, wait, let me use this as another tactic of war. That's from a Kabbalistic perspective. From another perspective, I just read this in a commentator on Rashi today. So it's actually based on a verse in today's Torah portion. That commentator said those gifts were all illusionary. They had no substance at all. It was just to fool his eyes. They were nothing. They were literally imaginary phantoms, vision. From another perspective, as Rashi's saying, from the literal meaning, Yaakov's saying, I'm not fearing him, I'm dealing with him. If I could deal with him with these presents, great, get him out of my way. If I have to deal with him with warfare, I'm up for it as well. And my choice of preference, I'm dealing with him with prayer. But in none of those ways am I fearing him. In none of those ways am I energizing him. And those are just 3 answers I gave you. There are many, 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 many more. But it's a great question. Dina?
So I know we segued off, but I wanted to just go back quickly for a second to that question. I know, like, bringing up big trigger events like Holocaust and things. My question is kind of the opposite of what I'm hearing, is that, like, how much of our fear fed that?
We don't want to look back and say that, God forbid. So I wouldn't speculate on that, but I will tell you the Midrash, very interesting. I'm not at all thinking about the Holocaust here, but the Midrash that speaks of with Moshe, when he had the situation with, if you remember, now we're going forward in the Torah. Now we're going to the first Torah portion of Shmos, the book of Exodus. So we're carrying a lot of different Torah portions in this class. And of course, nothing that I prepared yet, but don't worry, I have a lot of good stuff prepared. Hopefully we'll get to it today. Moshe was raised in the house of Pharaoh, right? He was the first 40 years of his life in Egypt. 40 years he had to run away, and he was in Midian. And then he came back and spent the next 40 years leading the Jews. So this was toward the end of the first 40 years. And he was at this point a supervisor. He had been raised as a prince in the palace. He was, of course, incredibly talented, incredibly brilliant, incredibly leader. So he was already appointed by Pharaoh to basically run the whole industries here in Egypt, including, of course, the slave industry, which is what he wanted. And he did things to help his Jewish brothers. Like he figured out, he said to Pharaoh, if we give these slaves one day off, then they'll have more strength, and then they'll work better for us the other 6, and we'll have more productivity. Brilliant idea. And Moshe figured it out, and he gave them off the day that was, Shabbos. So he was doing whatever he could. And then there's a situation where he saw this Egyptian unfairly beating and abusing a Jewish man, and he killed the Egyptian with God's holy name. And the next day, this man that he saved and his cohort, Dasan and Abiram, were fighting. And Moshe sees these 2 Jews fighting. He comes to intervene, and they're like, oh, you're going to kill us like you killed that Egyptian who he killed yesterday to save one of them. And they basically told him, we're going to go tell Paro what you really did. And it says he feared. The verse says, Vayira Moshe Moed. Moses was very scared of this. And then the verse continues and says, and then truly they went, and Paro didn't want to listen. In the end, he actually was convinced, very unwillingly, and he actually tried to execute Moshe, and that's when Moshe had to run away for the next 40 years of his life to Midian. The question is, why does the verse tell us Moshe was scared? Like, what is that? How does that propel the storyline forward? Like, what do we care if he was scared or not? I mean, we don't know what he ate for breakfast that morning either. So what? And the Midrash says, no, we need to know that because his fear is what gave them the power that they actually did go to Paro, and they did what they said they would do. Implying that if Moshe had not feared them, not feared their intentions, and just said, I trust in God, and which of course is what happened. Of course, he did trust in God, and he was saved from the executioner's knife. But if he had initially trusted that nothing would come from these 2 lowlifes, they would not have been able to go to Paro. So that's our perspective, and we hold on to that very strongly. We don't fear, we don't feed, we move forward with a lot of trust in God. Okay. Well, we do have some time remaining. I really had 2 parts of what I wanted to do today, both on this subject, but hopefully we'll get through the first part. And if not, that's great too, because we covered a lot of amazing things here. So another example, but please feel free to ask your questions, because when you ask questions, then we can digest these ideas that are supposed to be, my goal is practical. Your teenager, for those that have passed the 10, 12-year-olds and their meltdowns. Though teenagers could also have meltdowns in a different way. Your teenager is staying in his or her room the whole time, on the phone, you don't know with who. Identify the evil gripping this child. Her, let's just say her to make it simple. That's getting her to perhaps indulge in depression or obsessive unhealthy relationships, whatever's going on. There could be many details filling that script. 2, remind yourself evil has no power unless I empower it. 3, consciously choose and resolve not to empower the evil. And yes, 4, ignore this evil. Now, how do you ignore this evil? Well, internally ignore it. The only staying in her room, the constant conversations and texts and WhatsApps, internally ignore it, meaning don't fear it, ignore it. It's not a reality. And then walk into the room to interact normally, as if this is normal that you need to go into the room to talk to your child. And knock if it's locked, and then just have normal interactions as if the other stuff doesn't exist, to deflate it, to burst its hold. Or your husband. We spoke about you, we spoke about your kid. Let's get to your husband. Your husband's always on his phone, pays much more attention to that than to you. Identify the evil that's causing him to do it. Remind yourself evil has no power unless you empower it. Consciously choose and resolve not to empower it and ignore it. Ignore it. How do you ignore it? Ignore it, interact with him normally, as if he wasn't looking at his phone the whole time. And on the inside, don't let it bother you. on the inside. It has no power unless you give it power, and you're not giving it any power. So I'm sure the basic pattern is clear. I just made it very, very straightforward, and it's a very, very powerful formula. So I'd like to practice. I'm going to give you a situation and tell me what you think is the best way to minimize this negativity. Okay? This is a made-up situation, but I try to think of something that could be realistic depending on the age and stage of your children. If not now, maybe will be, maybe was. So you have a child who always procrastinates, delays doing his homework, goes to bed too late because that's what he only remembers about his homework. What from your side would be the best way to minimize this negativity, keeping in mind the approach we're working on, which is we don't want to feed it, we want to ignore it. Doesn't mean we don't deal, but we don't feed the evil. Tell me what your suggestions would be to this mom. I see a lot of moms out there. Come on, we should have more than 2 hands raised. I did not create a very weird, unusual, never heard of situation. I mean, maybe in your houses it never happened. So you're like, I don't know. Thank God my kids were not like that. Or actually they were, and I had no clue how to deal with it. So yeah, I'm not gonna raise my hand. The same technique, I want to shrink it by not feeding it. Obviously I have to deal with something here, but I'm dealing with it without feeding the negativity. Okay, Eliza, what are you gonna say?
So I've actually, as a classroom teacher, I had parents who were telling me, oh, my child is procrastinating, is doing the exact scenario. And I said, okay.
I was not being very original. I was just trying to think of something that happened.
But my response to them was, and they looked at me like, so what are we, and I said, so let them deal with it. You've already went through school. This isn't your homework. This is their homework anyway. It's not yours to do. So it's not your responsibility. Let it go. Don't make it even be a struggle, and let them handle the consequences. If they come into school without their homework done, then they'll have to deal with whatever the appropriate consequences are.
Perfect answer. Dean, I mean, there's more than one answer. So you could also give me other perfect answers, but that's a perfect example of exactly this approach. You're not feeding it. You're not fearing it. You're not emoting it. Dina, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar, but I was going to say in short, just to let them come into contact with the natural reinforcement or consequence in the world, and let them just support them on their journey, and just be with them while they realize, oh, the teacher might be mad at me, or the teacher might give me a lower grade when I don't do my homework, or I might be really tired because I have to wake up early and I'm not really so into that, or just be like, oh, wow, sounds like that's, maybe do you want help coming up with solutions for that? Just being with them as they come into contact with that consequence.
Perfect. I was going to say basically exactly what Dina and Eliza said. The only thing I would say that I added a bit more from this approach is, before you do anything, stop and remember what an awesome child this is. Because you're looking at this kid and saying he's so incompetent, and there goes the fear, and there goes the worry, and there goes the concern, and there goes so stop, breathe, and remember how competent this child is in everything he cares about, how put together he is, what he does do successfully. Remember what he does successfully, remember he's competent, look at him on the inside from the vision of his strengths. And then also, I think, which is sort of along the line of what Dina was saying, I would say an hour before bedtime, knowing he's so competent, remind him gently and firmly, bedtime's in an hour, no matter where your homework is holding, and I know you'll pull it all together. But again, what Eliza said is definitely exactly this approach, and what Dina's saying is this approach. So just in a very practical way, we're not feeding it. We're doing our best, like Dina's saying, to support the good and not to energize the other stuff. Dina, you're going to add something?
Just that I really, really like what you're saying about seeing, stop and seeing them as a whole person. Because I think sometimes, the daily just solving of problems is we're in that mode of just what's next that I got to figure out. And you don't want to get the call from the teacher, so you're just trying to solve it. But I really like how when you stop and think, and I want to do this more with my clients, of when you stop and think, this kid is so amazing and so great. Nobody's perfect, and here's some of it. Is it that big of a deal in the grand scheme of everything? and it's usually not. So I really like that like holistic perspective.
I hope I should remember this every time my kids drive me crazy, but definitely, it definitely helps. It definitely helps. So we only have like 5 more minutes left. Everything we did today, by the way, is what I call level 1 on this issue. And clearly we're not going to do level 2, but God willing, we will next week. And we're going to get a lot more deeper in understanding philosophically what's going on and sharpening our techniques and dealing with it. But just for now, for what we've done today, if everyone could take one situation in your life and apply it to this format. So I gave the situation of this procrastinating child. Is it the biggest situation in this mythical mother's life? I mean, it's not that was a made up situation. It's not my issue with my child. But probably not. But it's something that you could really see how you could apply these techniques, and it will really help. And it will really shrink and minimize the negativity. And it doesn't have to become something that you're constant warfare and eating yourself up and the incompetency and what's happening wrong in my home, that this is everything we do to ourselves. No, you could focus on the good, focus on the positive, shrink the negative. And yes, the solutions probably will emerge naturally. So if you can take something going on in your world, it doesn't have to be your biggest issue. It might be the one you're remembering from today, and think, how can you deal with it? Is there a way to deal with it from this perspective? Can you see a way? Just pretend it was theoretical and we're just discussing it abstractly in class. How can you focus on the good, strengthen the good, and deflate the negative by de-energizing it? De-energize the negative. So we just have a few minutes. If we could for a few minutes think about it, and then hopefully some people will come up with some great solutions, so they'll be glad they came to class tonight, and maybe somebody will share, so then we'll all gain, because if we didn't come up with something, it's always interesting to hear someone that did, and maybe that will help. And I'm going to try to think of one too for myself.